Thank you so much for this kind introduction and for the invitation to come join you on your campus. And thank you all for turning out this evening, especially if your mid-semester break is coming up. I can imagine that the temptation is strong just to get out of town. There's a certain point in early September when we were working out what the date for this talk would be, and I suddenly had second thoughts. Like, do I really want to give a talk on Napoleon's Russian campaign? The reason for that is my research, all of the different research projects I've done, they've all touched in some form on Napoleon's Russian campaign in 1812, and which is where the word patriotic war comes from, right? And I thought, you know, do I really want to talk about that again? Do I have anything new to say about it? And right then, because I remember this, I was thinking about this on September 10th. And right then, if you were following the news, you might remember this, the big Ukrainian offensive near Kharkiv got started. And I was, in my spare time, I was reading the webpage of this right-wing Russian blogger who, because I was curious about what right-wing Russians were saying about these events. And I came across a blog, let me see what I can make this work, by this guy, Yegor Kholmogorov. And so he has all these blog posts about the war, and he kept making reference to Napoleon's Russian campaign. And in particular, he made frequent reference to a man named Rostopchin, who had been one of the figures I had studied, who was one of the most important Russian nationalist propagandists of the time of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In fact, I was struck then when you look at the pictures that the Kholmogorov and Rostopchin even look the same. And Kholmogorov systematically compared the performance of the Russian army right now in Ukraine with the experience of the Russian army in 1812. And so I started doing more of this research on the internet, and I came across this political commentator, a guy by the name of Alksnis. Now, this is an article that had come out in August, but I came across it in late September, early October. And he's talking about his impression of the war in Ukraine. And he says this is not a special military operation, which is what Putin calls it. This is a new patriotic war. And the patriotic war is a reference to Napoleon's Russian campaign. And it's also a term that later was used for World War I and World War II. And then I got to thinking about it, and I know I'd seen these pictures of Putin with soldiers of the Kremlin Regiment. And the Kremlin Regiment is the special military regiment that is on duty to guard the Russian president and the Kremlin buildings. And for ceremonial occasions, they wear uniforms from the time of the wars against Napoleon. And this all got me thinking that actually there would be interesting new things to think about in connection with Napoleon's Russian campaign, which is the role that this has played as a template, right, as a template that Russians use to think about what a war is. So that actually is not just a piece of history from 200 years ago. It is a permanent kind of mental construct that Russians operate with when they try to interpret events around them. Now, I want to say here, it's not unusual for countries today to look back to the late 18th to mid-19th century and find models there. I mean, for instance, this at the top left these are Tea Party activists in the United States. At the bottom left, this is a protest about Confederate monuments. At the top right is the biggest budget German propaganda movie of World War II. What all three of them have in common is people are talking about present events by talking about events from the late 18th to mid-19th century. And when the Russians use 1812 as a template for the war today, they are doing something that's actually very standard across Western countries. And I want to talk about that for a moment and then go on specifically to the Russian case. If you've studied some of the history of Europe and the Americas, one of the things that you might have come across is that the modern nations of Europe and the Americas, as we know them today, right, those modern nations were formed in a series of wars and revolutions that extend from about 1770 to about 1870. Right? And the American Revolution and the American Civil War are two moments in that. The Napoleonic Wars are another moment, the French Revolution, the Latin American Independence Wars, the unification of Germany, and so forth. That all happens in that period. There's a specific aspect of this that I want to focus on for a moment, and that is nationalism. So nationalism is, and this is going to be relevant for understanding this Russian concept of patriotic war. That's why I'm talking about it. Nationalism is basically a new invention of this period from about 1770 to 1870. Right? What nationalism means is this. The traditional way that people in Western countries thought of themselves is that all of us who live in this country, whatever country that is, right, what binds us together is that we're all subjects of the same king. We don't really have a connection with each other. Our connection is with the king. The same way if all of you worked for the McDonald's Corporation, your bond is not with each other, it's with your employer. The employer hires you, the employer dismisses you, the employer pays you. Your connection with the other workers is incidental. If you're all tenants in the same apartment building, it's the same thing. Your connection is with a landlord, it's not with the other people who happen to live in the same building. Pre-modern European societies were conceived in the same way. Your bond is with the king, is whose subject you are, is not with the masses of people who happen to live in the same country. Nationalism is about reconceptualizing that. Right? Nationalism is about saying all of us who make up the people, all of us should be one community. And this community is the nation. This community should be united. Right? We should be spiritually united as a people, and we have some kind of common destiny that we should be pursuing. Like for Americans, that meant uniting the colonies and then having some kind of American destiny, which is something about freedom, right? And what this destiny means might vary from one country to another, but the core idea is unify the people and bring them together for some kind of shared purpose. A major way of creating this unity was a war or a revolution. Right? A war, basically, because unite the nation against someone. You can unite it against a domestic tyrant, or you can unite it against a foreign enemy. That's why revolution or war. But so, an important thing then from this period is this new idea that the people of a country should be a nation, and this nation in a war or a revolution is a chance to bring the people together and create a sense of shared identity. Those shared identities are created in that period, and that's why we keep referring back to it. That's why people in America who oppose what they think is tyranny might dress up in revolutionary outfits. Those who oppose racism might remember the Civil War, because that is the formative period of modern nations. So it's the same for Russia. For Russians also, that era is when their sense of nationhood is formed. So what I want to do now is talk about, so first I want to start off then by talking about the era when Napoleon's Russian campaign happened and what Russia's part was in that, and then go on and analyze some of the significance of this. So the starting point here is the French Revolution. And this is an image, a patriotic image of French people enthusiastically going off to war to defend their revolutionary government against its foreign enemies. I'm going to simplify this real radically. But the French Revolution happened in, does anyone know when the French Revolution was?
1783.
Almost.
1789 and 1933.
Yes, very good. 1789, here's the key date. Thank you. So the French Revolution breaks out in 1789, and it triggers a series of wars between France and almost all the other major European powers. So for the next roughly 25 years, all of Europe is at war at various times against France. France is taken over in 1799 by who?
Napoleon.
Napoleon, exactly. So after 1799, France is ruled by Napoleon. But Napoleon basically maintains the kind of regime that the revolution had created. So Napoleon is really the successor of the French Revolution. So there's a series of wars, and these wars are driven by three big issues. And these are the same issues we'll see in connection with so-called patriotic wars in Russia. So I'd like you to pay attention to these three issues. The first issue is ideological. The basic point here is the French revolutionaries destroyed the traditional political and social system in France. Right? They overthrew the monarchy, abolished the nobles, weakened the church. So they, in doing that, right, in attacking the king and the nobles and the church, the French revolutionaries attacked the traditional order in France, and then they set out to attack the traditional order all over the rest of Europe. And so on one level, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars are a war over ideology, over whether you will keep the traditional system or destroy it in favor of something new, which is what the French want. A second level is geopolitical. Right? France was a great power, and as the French won one war after another, they came to dominate much of Europe. And so the other European states were hostile to France because they did not want the French state, whether revolutionary or any other kind. They didn't want the French state to dominate European affairs. The third level is national. The national idea is that some people made the argument that these wars were not just about states. It's not just whether the French state is going to be stronger than the British state or the Prussian state. It's about the nations, that is the peoples. Whether the French nation would dominate all the other nations, or whether the other nations would be able to defend themselves and pursue their own destiny. And here, nationalist intellectuals were excited about these wars. Because nationalist intellectuals felt that if the people were mobilized against the French, then that would give the people of whatever country they were in, it would allow them to discover their national identity. A little bit, think of how political activists in our society are really excited about mass protests. Because they always have this feeling that the people are passive. And if you actually could have thousands of people going into the street protesting over whatever the issue is, that will awaken people's feelings. It will create a mass movement. That is how nationalist intellectuals saw the wars with France. That this is a chance to build a sense of nationhood in whatever country we happen to be in. As you might imagine, the governments of the European states were totally on board with the ideological and the geopolitical things. They were not on board with this national aspect. Right? No European king was interested in a mass mobilization of the people, because that was liable to threaten the governments. So the ideological and geopolitical side, that the intellectuals and the governments both supported. The national idea, that's something for intellectuals then that the governments were generally suspicious of. So keep these 3 points in mind, because those are going to keep coming back over the course of my talk. Right? The ideological, geopolitical, and national aspect of these wars. Now here's where Russia comes in. Russia was involved in several wars against first revolutionary France and then Napoleonic France. The big story in Russia starts in 1807. So in 1807, Napoleon defeated the Russians in the most recent war. And at that point, at the conclusion of that war, Napoleon controlled most of continental Europe. If you look at this map here, everything outlined on my computer it looked red, here it looks more purple. But everything outlined with that thick line was under French control. That's either France itself or states that France controlled. And as you can see, that's basically every significant power in Europe except for Britain and Russia. So geopolitically, Napoleon completely controlled Europe. The Russians in 1807, as Russia's Emperor Alexander I, the Russians were forced to sign an alliance with him, but they did so very reluctantly because they didn't like this either ideologically or geopolitically. Napoleon understood that the Russians were unreliable allies, that they were allied with him only because they had to be. And Napoleon could, who's Napoleon's arch enemy? Which country? Great Britain. And Napoleon figured that Great Britain is going to keep fighting as long as there's realistic hope that they're going to find allies. And as long as there's a big independent Russia out there that's not a reliable ally for France, the British are going to have every reason to keep fighting. And so if you want to eventually defeat the British and make them make peace, you have to really make sure that the Russians fall into line with France. So Napoleon's approach, he decided since the Russians are unreliable allies, he would have to defeat them in a war and force them to accept France's terms. So in June of 1812, right, 1812 is a huge date in Russian history. Right, in America, the War of 1812 is one of those wars that you might know something about or you might not. In Russia, 1812 is gigantic. In June of 1812, Napoleon invades Russia with a huge army. And his goal, what he expected, right, what he expected is that the Russian army was near the border with France. He expected that the Russians would stand and fight. There'd be a big battle. The Russian army would get crushed. And then the Russians would have to make peace. Right? That was the plan. What happened that Napoleon did not expect is the Russians began to retreat. Now, often if an army retreats, often it'll disintegrate. The Russians retreated in good order, and the French pursued them. Now, what happened then is one of the most famous stories in military history. Right? The Russians retreated eastward. The French marched after them. As the French army moved east, it kept getting weaker. Right? They had trouble bringing up supplies. Their casualties mounted. So the French army got weaker while the Russian army got stronger. This is the example of French troops. The Russians conducted a mass mobilization. So on the one hand, you had a militia was set up. This militia and this Russian cartoon at the top, this sort of patriotic Russian cartoon illustrates that. The militia was made up of peasants, that is, of farmers, who were recruited just for the duration of the war. So normally armies back then were made up of professional soldiers, but the Russian army was expanded with this militia of people who were only drafted for the duration of the war. And then in areas that the French occupied, there was a guerrilla war against them by Russian peasants, which is illustrated by this Russian cartoon at the bottom. And what you can see, of course, on both pictures is these are both Russian cartoons that celebrate the toughness of the Russians and the wimpiness of the French. But so you have the Russians retreat, the French pursue them but get weaker, the Russians mobilize larger numbers of people. There's a huge but inconclusive battle at a place called Borodino, west of Moscow. So it's a huge battle, but the French do not manage to achieve the final victory that they hoped. Finally, the French occupy the city of Moscow, but Moscow goes up in flames during the French occupation. And this is a Russian painting that shows Napoleon and his entourage in the Kremlin while the entire city is being consumed by a gigantic firestorm. The effect of the fire of Moscow is that the French could not spend the winter in Moscow as they'd hoped. By now it's fall, and so the French realize that the Russians aren't giving up. They're not standing for a big battle. The French supply sources are far away. The French army has to retreat and get back to its home bases. The French retreat, and then the winter sets in. And so on the way back to their home bases in Poland, the French army is harassed by Russian troops and by Russian peasants. They encounter horrific climatic conditions with a brutally cold winter. Napoleon's army largely gets destroyed, and Russia goes on to destroy Napoleon's empire. And by 1814, the Russian Tsar is in Paris. So this is a gigantic event in Russian history. Russians come to refer to this war as the Patriotic War. Patriotic, that's a bit of a misleading translation, right? A better translation is the war for the fatherland, or the war for the homeland. So the implication is that it is a war, is not a war in some distant country to defend some kind of strategic interest. It's a war by the nation itself to defend the homeland against a foreign invader. This meaning, the meaning of 1812 as a patriotic war only evolves gradually. It's over the course of the 19th century that Russian intellectuals worked out what they thought 1812 was about. I mean, if you think of it in American history, right, the United States entered World War II because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But eventually, over decades, the meaning of World War II was, I think, reinterpreted in the United States to be a war to defeat Nazi tyranny in Europe. So even though at the time, what triggered it was really something very different. And that's a common thing with wars, that over a long period after the war ends, people develop a conception of what it all meant. And so in Russia, this conception gets created over the course of the 19th century. Right? The greatest work of fiction that gets written about the 1812 war is Tolstoy's War and Peace. A gigantic cathedral gets built in Moscow to commemorate Russia's victory. Monuments to generals go up everywhere. If you've ever heard Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, that celebrates the Russian victory in 1812. Paintings, you've seen some of the paintings that I showed. Those are there to celebrate the Russian victory. They're paintings, they're poems, they're plays, they're what have you. This is a gigantic, this is the biggest thing that happens in Russia until World War I. So there's 100 years there to create a cult of the war. So it becomes to be known as the Patriotic War, and the Patriotic War has these three elements, which are basically the three elements I talked about before. First of all, there's an ideological component. Remember, there's ideological, geopolitical, and national. The ideological component is that Napoleon represented the West. Right? The West in the 19th century is creating a new way of organizing society. This has to do with liberal government and capitalist economics, and a more secular culture. And as against that, Russians increasingly define themselves as a monarchy and as a non-capitalist society and as a religious culture. So partly, the meaning of the Patriotic War gets embedded in this idea of a modern Western ideology that is invading Russia and trying to destroy the traditional Russian way of life. That's how the ideological component gets redefined. There's a second element that's geopolitical. And here we have to go into a little bit of history. So, okay. If you look at these four maps here, you can see on all four maps the borders of modern Europe, right? Like right here, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland. Those same borders appear on all four maps. If you look at the map on the top left, that shows Kievan Rus in the 12th century. What you see there is Kiev, that's the predecessor state, that's the original state in that part of Europe. What you can see is it included what is today Russia, what is today Belarus, and what is today Ukraine. Then, by the 17th century, Kievan Rus was gone. What you had instead was Russia, and then Poland, Lithuania. And Poland, Lithuania had what is now Poland, and Lithuania, of course, and Belarus and Ukraine. So Belarus and Ukraine had been connected with Russia at the time of Kievan Rus, but are now connected with Poland in the 17th century. Then what happens, in 1795, if you look at the top, you'll see, if you look at the light, if you compare these two maps here, you can see in pale green on the right the outline of the former Polish-Lithuanian lands in Belarus and Ukraine. You see by 1795 the Russians had that. As far as the Russians were concerned, this was a reunification, right? That Russia had recreated the lands of Kievan Rus. Now what happens then in 1809 is Napoleon creates a new Polish state right here. And once Napoleon created a new Polish state, the Russians freaked out because they said this Polish state is going to want our Belarusian and Ukrainian territories back. So the Russians regarded the creation of this Polish state as the beginning of French aggression against Russia to take back the Belarusian and Ukrainian lands that had been part of Kievan Rus in the Middle Ages, but were later a part of Poland-Lithuania. Does this all make sense? I mean, the core thought to understand here, the core point to understand, is that you have Belarus and Lithuania, and Ukraine, that had connections both with Poland and with Russia. And as far as the Russians were concerned, if these lands are not under Russian control, then they're under the control of our enemies in Poland. And we have to prevent that from happening. And Poland was allied with France, which means that Napoleon's invasion of Russia is partly understood as a Polish invasion to regain Belarus and Lithuania and Ukraine and take them away from the Russians. So that is the geopolitical aspect. That the geopolitical aspect of the 1812 Patriotic War is who's going to control Belarus and Ukraine. So there's the ideological aspect against the modern West, and there's the geopolitical aspect about Poland, Ukraine, Belarus. And thirdly, there's the national aspect, which you'll remember this picture of the mass mobilization, that the Russian image of the Patriotic War of 1812 was a mass mobilization of the people to defend the Russian heartland against the Western invaders. So 1812 became this moment that Russian nationalists celebrated when the people had risen against the French, against the Westerners. And the Russian government, as you might imagine, was very ambivalent about this. The Russian government was really unenthusiastic about the idea of celebrating peasants who on their own took up arms and attacked soldiers. Because today they might attack French soldiers and tomorrow they'll attack the soldiers of the Russian Tsar. So this idea of the people rising up against the Western invaders, that from the Russian government standpoint was very problematic. For a Russian nationalist intellectual, that was something to be proud of. So this is broadly the image of the Patriotic War of 1812. It's a Russia that includes Ukraine and Belarus, a Russia that's conservative against the modern West, a Russia that's defending its geopolitical interests in Ukraine and Belarus against the Poles and the French, and a Russia in which the people rise up, and therefore the people deserve to be treated with respect by the Russian regime, which wasn't always the case. These ideas, so the 1812 War crystallized these kinds of concepts. Various things happened in the 19th century to reinforce these ideas. In 1830 and 31, there was by now the core of Poland, I should say, after the defeat of Napoleon, the Russians annexed the core of Poland. And what this map shows the European part of the Russian Empire, and the different colors are different language groups or different nationalities. So where it's pink is Russian, down here is more Ukrainian, that's Belarusian, that's Polish. So in 1830, there was an uprising in Poland, and Russian nationalists interpreted that as Polish aggression against Russia. Because not only do the Poles want to become independent, they're going to want to take back Belarus and Ukraine, which ought to be Russian. Then in 1839, right, there was a branch of Catholicism, or there's a religious denomination in Ukraine and Belarus that's sometimes called Uniate, which is a kind of hybrid of Orthodox and Catholic. The Russian government regarded Uniates as an ideological threat because Poland is Catholic while Russia is Orthodox. So in 1839, the Russian government forced the Uniates to all become Orthodox, which is basically a way of saying Polish Western ideological presence in Russia is a problem, and we have to get rid of it. In 1853 to 56, there was the Crimean War, which Russia fought against France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire. France was led by the nephew of Napoleon. Russia was led by the brother of Tsar Alexander I. So in many ways, the Crimean War is almost like a rematch of 1812. In 1863, there was another Polish uprising. which triggered another wave of Russian nationalist backlash. And by this point, the Russians were starting to regard not only the Poles, but also the Ukrainians as a threat to the unity of the Russian Empire. Because as far as the Russian government was concerned, Ukrainians are basically Russian, but they might be tempted to join the Poles and become Russia's enemies. And so anyone who encourages Ukrainians to speak Ukrainian instead of Russian is actually undermining the Russian Empire. So my point is, if you think of the issues from the Patriotic War as being a Western ideological threat to Russia and a geopolitical threat that's focused on Belarus and Ukraine and that's connected with Poland, and both of these themes are kept being revived by each of these events. And what you see in each of these cases is a demand by Russian nationalists that the Russian government should become more nationalistic. That the Russian, especially in the Crimean War, that the Russian government should mobilize the Russian people and should not, that in a sense Russia, it shouldn't necessarily become more democratic in terms of elections and a constitution, but that Russia should be run in a less autocratic way. It should be run in a way that the Russian people have more of an active role, and that wars are the occasion to do that. These themes continue into the 20th century. Here we have World War I and World War II. World War I was officially labeled by the Russian government as a patriotic war. In fact, it was officially the second patriotic war because it's the first big war for about the defense of the Russian heartland in the way that the First World War was. So Russians during the First World War were explicitly told that this is a second version of the patriotic war, and World War II was officially known as the Great Patriotic War. And in fact, if you look at these Soviet cartoons, you can see the explicit linking of Hitler with Napoleon. So Russians Soviets were continually reminded of this model. So people were told that this is a patriotic war in the 1812 mold. Especially World War II had a strong ideological component, right? The threat to the Soviet Union was Nazi ideology, and beyond that, the Nazis as a form of Western capitalism. So it's a war partly about ideology, partly it's geopolitical, and the geopolitics, once again, is about Belarus and Ukraine. The Germans defeated the Russians in the First World War, and if you look at what the Germans planned to do, they basically planned to turn, this is the map at the top, the Germans planned to turn Ukraine into an independent country that would be controlled by Germany. If you look at World War II, the Germans planned to colonize Ukraine and Belarus with German settlers. But in both wars, in other words, not just is there the same ideological threat from a Western country, there's the same geopolitical threat to the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union in the form of a threat to Ukraine and Belarus. And finally, there's a national aspect to the war. What you find here in both wars, in both the First and the Second World War, is there's a widespread feeling in the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union that the country was too authoritarian. Right? In the First World War, the problem was that Tsar Nicholas II tried to run everything himself and refused to take any input from the public. In the Second World War, the issue was that Stalin ran the Soviet Union as a really oppressive police state. And so there's a widespread hope in the country in both wars that as the people mobilized for the war, the government itself would become more respectful of the people and less oppressive. So the same national theme that we've seen in earlier wars, that if the people rise up to defend the country, then the government will change how it treats them. That same theme is there in both of those wars. And World War II, I have to say, has a specifically Russian and Ukrainian component to it that's relevant today. Because by the time of World War II, the Soviets didn't primarily regard Poland as a big threat anymore. That is, the threat to Soviet domination in Belarus and Ukraine was no longer primarily Poland, it was primarily Ukrainian nationalism. And the story here is that Ukraine has suffered terribly in the 1930s and early 40s, right? When there was this gigantic famine in the Soviet Union called the Holodomor, it struck very hard at Ukraine. And many Ukrainians think that this was a deliberately engineered policy against their country. So the Ukrainians suffered terribly under Stalin in the 1930s, and then they suffered terribly under the German occupation in the Second World War. The consequence is that Ukrainians had to choose sides, and some Ukrainians sided with the Soviets, and others sided with the Nazis. And as I'm illustrating there with this recruitment poster for a Ukrainian SS division. So on the one hand, the Ukrainians suffered so badly under both of these regimes, and at least some of them decided to side with the Germans against the Soviets. What happened from the Soviet side, on the other hand, and there the Soviet poster on the top right is there to illustrate this. The Soviet government appealed to people's patriotism, but often this patriotism was coded as a specifically Russian patriotism. That the Soviet Union was identified with Russia, and the Soviet Union and the Soviet people with the Russian people. And so if you were going to be supporting the Soviet war effort, in some sense you were expected to identify yourself specifically with the Russian people and the Russian nation. What this did is it created a certain tension between Russian and Ukrainian identity. Because on the one hand, Ukrainians began to, or some number of Ukrainians learned to reject the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union appeared as specifically Russian. And on the other hand, some number of Russians became anti-Ukrainian because they linked Ukrainian nationalism with supporting the Nazis. And this is relevant today because, as you might know, the Russian government routinely labels the Ukrainian government as Nazis, which makes no sense on its face, right? There's nothing Nazi-like in any objective sense about the Ukrainian government. But if what you've learned as a Russian is Nazis hated Russians, right? What Nazism was about was hating Russia, and Ukrainian nationalists were supporters of the Nazis, and the people in Ukraine today are Ukrainian nationalists, then those linkages make sense. So in other words, this geopolitical conflict over who's going to control Belarus and Ukraine, in World War II, it helps to feed these kinds of national tensions between Russians and Ukrainians. So the big themes, just to quickly recap what we're at, the big themes when Russians imagined a war as a patriotic war, as opposed to any other kind of war, right? A patriotic war has these three elements. There's a hostile Western ideology connected with somebody in the West. It's connected directly with somebody close by, like Ukrainians or Poles, and then it's connected with some big power farther out, like Germany or France. Right? There's a hostile Western ideology. There's an attempt by someone in the West to take control of Belarus and Ukraine. And there's a thought that if the Russian people could mobilize for war, then they would achieve a greater sense of freedom and dignity in their own life, in their own society. That they would be treated better by their own state if they came together and united in a big war effort. So, from about the Great Patriotic, if you mention the word patriotic war, I think, to a modern Russian, this is the one that they're thinking of. Right? The Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, that's the big one that really sticks in people's memory. From about the 1960s on, the memory of the Second World War became really central to Soviet ideology. So essentially, from about the 1960s on, fewer and fewer people in the Soviet Union really believed in communist ideology. And so the basis for loyalty to the regime increasingly was the memory of the shared effort in World War II, right? We like Stalin not because he promoted communism, but because he led us to victory over the Nazis. That's the mindset. So for example, annual parades on Victory Day, which was May 9th, annual parades in downtown Moscow on Victory Day became a regular feature in the 1960s. This ideology This enormous ideological focus on the Great Patriotic War was amplified under Putin. So the Russian government under Putin really doubled down on the celebration of the Great Patriotic War. One aspect of this, and an important aspect of this, is that the Great Patriotic War was increasingly seen as specifically Russian, not Soviet. So even though all the peoples of the Soviet Union had taken part in this, including the Ukrainians, for example, the Russian government and its supporters have increasingly defined the Great Patriotic War against the Nazis as a specifically Russian accomplishment, an achievement of the Russian people. This brings us to the present, right, to Vladimir, and these are going to be the last points I want to make. This brings us to the present, to Vladimir Putin and his supporters among Russian nationalists in the context of the current war in Ukraine. Now remember, what were the three issues that keep coming up, we first see the Napoleonic Wars and that keep coming up in patriotic wars? What's the first one? Right, that's the second one. Okay, doesn't matter. Geopolitical is one. Ideological. National. Right, those three themes. You see those exact three themes again. The ideological element is a threat to Russia's well-being by a Western ideology, and particularly some kind of modern ideology, some kind of ideology that's about a specifically modern way of doing things that attacks a more traditional way of doing things in Russia. The present version of this has to do with gender and sexuality. That's the aspect of this that Russian nationalists today emphasize the most. Right, so I mean, this is, I just Googled a couple of terms and came up with this text from the Russian military publication. I don't remember what the occasion is. I think this might have been when transgender people could serve in the US military. That might have been the occasion for it. But this kind of rhetoric, if you think of in America, right-wing critiques of left-wing woke culture, right? That, like an intensified version of that, is the view that Russian nationalists and the Russian government have of the entire modern West. So instead of the West overthrowing kings and overthrowing nobles and overthrowing churches, what the West is doing is destroying the family and destroying traditional gender identities. But so the ideological element is absolutely there. It just takes a slightly different form than it did in the past. Secondly, the geopolitical aspect is there again. And the geopolitical issue now is the expansion of NATO. Right? NATO has expanded into virtually all of Eastern Europe. And the Ukrainians have made clear over a number of years that they would love to join NATO also. And the only reason they haven't joined yet is because NATO hasn't let them. So if you are trained in a Russian way of thinking that says that Russia's strategic and geopolitical future depends on Belarus and Ukraine, the West's expansion is just as much of a threat as were the German plans in World War I and World War II, or as were the concerns about rebuilding Poland in the 19th century, or as was Napoleon's expansion. Both of these points, and this also means that as far as Russian nationalists are concerned, people in Ukraine have a choice. They can be loyal to their own people, and that means supporting Russia, or they can be traitors. And the 19th century version of those traitors would have supported the French or the Poles. The 20th century version of those traitors would have supported the Germans. And the 21st century version of those traitors would support, NATO and the Americans. But it's essentially the same theme that recurs. So on these 2 points, the ideological and the geopolitical, the Russian government, there's Putin's government, and Russian nationalist intellectuals, like the blogger I showed you at the beginning, on these issues they agree, the ideological and the geopolitical. You won't be surprised that they disagree on which issue? The same one they've always disagreed on. What's the third item? National, right? The national component is the idea that in a big war, the people will come together. The people will be empowered. The Russian government does not like this, right? The people somehow coming together and expressing their will is just as much of a threat to Putin as it was to Stalin, as it was to Nicholas II or as it was to Alexander I. This is why, presumably, right now this is my understanding, this is why Putin wanted this war to be a special military operation. Right? What special military operation means is not a full-scale war where the whole country has to be on a war footing. We take a handful of existing forces, we carry out a kind of police operation. If you think of the American invasion of Panama back around 1990, right, that would have been a special military operation. As a citizen, you wake up in the morning, you read the papers, that's your only connection with it. Right, that's what Putin wanted this to be, because he precisely does not want a mass mobilization of the people. Russian right-wingers are totally different. I remember back, already this same blogger I was showing you earlier, I remember reading some of this stuff back in 2014 when Russia took over the Crimea and began to encroach on the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And a buzzword that was circulating among Russian nationalists back then was the Russian Spring. Spring in the sense of springtime. Right? You all might, or you probably don't remember this because you were in middle school back then. There's the Arab Spring about 10 years ago. And what the Arab Spring was the label for a movement of revolutions in Arab countries, where the crowds would go on the street and try to take control of their country. And Russian nationalists, who were fine with Putin, were speaking of the Russian Spring. As the Russians in the Donbass, in the Ukraine, were no longer just going to be passive victims of fate, but they were going to take charge of their destiny. These same people now favor essentially total war. What these same people want is a total mass mobilization of the Russian people. And what we are witnessing today, right, with Putin kind of reluctantly announced this partial mobilization, and what you're seeing is the tension between these two conceptions of what a Russian war should be like. That the Russian nationalist intellectuals and bloggers want a patriotic war with a mass mobilization. And Putin supports them on the ideological and geopolitical side, but he does not want a patriotic war with masses of people. And there's good reasons for this, right? If you take, and this will be my last point, and then I'll wrap up. If you take the 4 past wars that could in any way qualify as patriotic wars, right? I would say there's 1812, there's the Crimean War, and then there's World Wars I and II. Russia won 2 of those, and it lost 2 of those. Does anyone know which ones did they win? Well, what happened in 1812?
They retreated, the French got bogged down, and then the Russians counterattacked the World War.
Exactly. So ultimately the Russians won, right? 1812 ends up as a victory. Crimean War, that might be the most obscure. Yes, sir? Right. They lost the Crimean War. Very good. World War I. They lost. And of course, World War II, they won. So 2 defeats, 2 victories. What you see in those 4 cases is the 2 times that Russia won, against Napoleon and against Hitler, the end of the war was followed by a conservative clampdown in Russia. So Russia became much more oppressive after both of those victories than it had been during the war, because the Russian government, or Soviet government's goal was to establish control and prevent any kind of, mobilization of the people. The 2 times that they lost, the government went into massive crisis. After the Crimean War, the Russian government was forced to carry out sweeping reforms of the country. And what happened after Russia's defeat in World War I?
The revolution?
Yeah, the revolution, and the Russian government collapsed. Now, I have no deep insight into Vladimir Putin's thinking, but I can imagine that he can figure out this history as well. And that once you have a patriotic war, it's a lot better to be on the winning side than on the losing side of that. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So, a wonderful presentation. Some really a lot of things to chew on there. I just want to see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much for speaking tonight. It was a phenomenal presentation. shall the authorization use my future. So, with regard to the present annexation of the eastern regions, you played the first part, you played the second part. Should we be wary that with the annexation of these Ukrainian territories, we are crossing a threshold with Ukrainian forces advancing into these annexed territories, that we could go from a special military action to a full-blown brave war now that he is justifying potentially Russian swinging the invaders?
But first of all, as a historian, I'm not under obligation to make predictions. Like political scientists have to make predictions, right? No, I'm just saying he has to actually answer questions like this. I can fall back on, oh, I do the past. Having said that, my hunch would be that yes. I mean, in other words, that and here I have to say I'm going by what I read in in news commentaries, right? But my hunch definitely would be that by declaring that the fought over territories are part of the Russian homeland, he is in a sense moving Russia closer to this patriotic war model. And that would make it harder to make peace, or make it harder to have a compromise peace, right? As long as these are occupied territories, you can always say, okay, well, we use them as bargaining chips. Once they're part of the homeland, it's hard to do that without going home and telling people you've betrayed the country. And so in that sense, I mean, it's a very worrisome development, I would think.
And that kind of leads into my next question. Nationalism has constantly been a part of this, as well as ideological. I feel like that kind of changed the game when we talk about how do we support Ukraine in the best way possible, and what are we going to make them accept in order to have a satisfied Russia? Because it doesn't seem like there is a lot that they were going to accept as satisfaction, and if we push past the breaking point, we could have some worrisome developments because we understand the ideological development coming from Russia.
If we push whom past the breaking point?
Russia. If we're like, we won't concede, they're having to mobilize more and more, now it's starting to have civil unrest, and now it's like, well, Russia has to, once again, press the ante in this conflict.
I mean, it's an interesting question. And again, I don't really have a good answer to that. What I would say is that, and here I'm trying to bring this back to my history expertise because I can talk more intelligently about that. I think in the past, this nationalist ideology has never really had a mass following in Russia. And I think that's a significant point, that if you look at these past so-called patriotic wars, it's always been members of the elites who've talked about it that way. Right? So in 1812, the Russian government's big concern is that the peasants are going to rebel against the Russian government. That was their concern again in the Crimean War. In the First World War, the peasants did in fact do that. So there's always been a sense in Russia that nationalist ideology is primarily something that members of the elite talk about with each other. It's not something that has a huge mass following. So for example, Russia in modern times has never had a mass political party that is based on a nationalist ideology. And I think in Soviet times, right, and that's, for anyone certainly my age or older, that's where you grew up, right? So I mean, it's not, for your age group, this seems like a long time ago, but for a lot of people it's not. There wasn't, Russianness was kind of the default in the Soviet Union. So there wasn't really any need to be a Russian nationalist. I mean, a lot of Russians kind of casually look down on other nationalities and assume that, well, of course, Russians are better than other people, but there wasn't really a well-developed ideology. So an interesting question is how many people in Russia actually buy into this patriotic war idea? And World War II is a bit different because the Nazis, I think because the Nazis posed such an elementary existential threat to the whole population with their genocidal policies that it made sense for people to feel directly threatened. But otherwise, it's not at all clear, I think, that most of the Russian population is actually behind any of these ideas. So an interesting now, one further point about this, one of the things that Putin has done, and that successful dictatorships always do, is they shut down the free expression of public opinion. And that means there's actually no way of knowing what most people think. So if let's say tomorrow there were a coup in Moscow and somebody else came to power and gave the Ukrainian territories back and made peace, right? I'm not saying that that's likely. I'm just saying if hypothetically that happened, we have no way of knowing whether most Russians would object to that or would be okay with it. So in that sense, I think, who knows, it could be that they could reverse these things and it would have no effect.
I guess my better question would be probably be figuring out what the modern burning Moscow is to the Russian government. And this seems like, they're willing to burn the city, move these laws, they're willing to let the city be polarized and more of the city. You should probably figure out what their direction is. What is their acceptable law?
Yeah, and that, I don't know. And I'm guessing there's lots of smart people in Washington and elsewhere who are puzzling over this. Yes, sir.
So I do kind of have a question about kind of both the extent and the idea of Russian nationalism. My own family actually is from Russia, but as you mentioned, during the Soviet times it was a lot different. The default was Russianness. But my own parents, on my mom's side, though they were Armenian, they kind of identified more with Sovietness at the time, Armenianness. So did most Russians, and as you said, it's kind of hard to know their opinions, at least among the political elites, do they view this more as a stepping stone toward the more traditional reunification of the Russian people, as in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarusians? Or are they kind of looking toward this being the first step, assuming Russia emerges victorious, kind of toward the reunification of the former Soviet lands or further?
That's an interesting question. And again, I don't want to give a real definitive answer on this because so much of this is unknowable or in flux. But I think the Russians in modern times have not had a sense of nationalism in the way that a lot of European peoples have. I mean, if you look, for example, at the Poles, or at the Germans, or at the Czechs, right, or the Irish, their history is living in mixed multi-ethnic societies and trying to define their own nationality by separating themselves from the people around them. So to be Irish meant not to be British, and to be Polish meant not to be German, for example, and so forth. The Russians, throughout their modern history, have been the dominant group of a multi-ethnic population. And so the tendency has been to assume that there's obviously real ethnic Russians, but there are also these people, like I could imagine your family, who are kind of Russian. Right, they're Russian enough that nobody cares about the differences. Right, they speak Russian and they think like Russian. I don't know about your family, obviously, but what you were describing. Right, there are people who might not fit the narrow definition of Russianness, but that's okay, because they're part of our system and so forth. And I think what you have, and there's always been a subset of Russian nationalists who didn't like that, because in Russia, this being multi-ethnic, I think, has often gone with an authoritarian regime. That you have a society that's divided into different groups, and what the different groups have in common is that they're ruled by the same czar or the same communist party. So Russians who want a society that's less dominated by the state have often been nationalists who wanted a clearer sense of pure Russian nationality. Putin, I think, has kind of tried to have it both ways. Right? Partly his regime's public image is very much about Russian nationality and Russian tradition and Russianness. And in Ukraine, he makes this whole argument that the Russian speakers in Ukraine are ethnically Russian and therefore Russia has to defend them. So in one way, he makes an argument about a narrow Russia. But he also makes his argument that Russia is a multicultural place. And Russians, if you go, at least years ago, I remember visiting the big World War II memorial complex that was built outside of Moscow. And that was built there during Putin's reign, and which had religious shrines, which is already kind of bizarre if you know the atheist Soviet Union that fought World War II, but okay. But if you look at the religious shrines, there's a great big Orthodox church, but there's also a mosque, and there's also a synagogue, on the theory that Russia is a multinational country, and we want everybody to be represented. And Putin officially supports the Orthodox Church, but he officially also supports what he considers the traditional religions of the peoples of Russia, including Islam and Buddhism and Judaism. So I think the Russian government is trying to maintain both of these identities. Their claim, I think what's happening with Ukraine, this is my impression, is the original thought, I think, was we're going to liberate the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are really a form of Russians deep down. They're ruled by these Nazis, but they like to get rid of the Nazis, and so when we invade them, we'll be greeted as liberators. And in that sense, the Ukraine, it's like the bottle that can be half full and half empty. In that sense, the Ukrainians were a bottle that was half full. They're Russian enough that they're part of our country. My sense from what I've read is what's happened in Russia is as the war goes on, the bottle has become more half empty. That is, it's not that the Ukrainians are kind of Russian and therefore they're like us, it's they're only kind of Russian, but the whole other side of them is like evil Westerners and so they're enemies. So my guess, if I had to hazard a guess for the future, I think what Putin's war is doing is creating a much stronger sense of nationality. Of Russians probably defining themselves more strongly as Russian, Ukrainians defining themselves more strongly as Ukrainian, and it getting much harder for people to say, I'm really a combination of all of these things. Yes, sir?
Generationally, it seems like Russia, the government of Russia and the people of Russia have such a strong disconnect. And I don't know if there's a question in this or not, but that seems like the underlying problem throughout. Maybe you've already answered it, but I can't, it's something that just keeps, in my mind, is there's this disconnect between what the government wants to do and what the people want to do, and there's revolutions and there's this and that, but there doesn't seem to be any proper overlap of what the Russian government and what the people of Russia want to do. And again, I don't know if there's a question in there, but...
Yeah, I would agree with that up to a point. That is, if you're in a country like the United States, which has a very strong civil society, right, what happens is people organize themselves in all kinds of ways. So we have political parties, and predictably certain people are going to be Democrats and others are going to be Republicans and others are going to complain about both of them. We have big media outlets, and predictably some people prefer Fox and others prefer MSNBC. And you have, in all kinds of different areas of life, we organize ourselves. And that means if you want to know what organized American society thinks, there are people who you can go to and ask. You can go to the leaders of the parties, go to the leaders of big civic organizations, and they can somehow speak, collectively, they can speak for the people. And collectively, they have a lot of influence over our government. What you traditionally have in Russia is that this civil society is weakly organized. There are no political parties with mass memberships. There are no, the media organizations are all controlled by the state, so who knows whose opinion they really reflect. So Russians, what you tend to have is, I think, lots of isolated individual people, and then a state, but not a lot of structures in between. So if you wanted to know what do the Russian people want in terms of government, the answer would have to be that there's no mechanism by which the Russian people can form an opinion. And so what you have is an absence of a formed opinion, and in that absence you have the state. Now I think a lot of Russians traditionally think of their society as kind of anarchic, right? That there are no strong structures that you can rely on. So you tend to look to powerful individuals to solve your problems. I've always been struck by this in my dealings with Russia, that if you deal with Russian institutions, like Russian universities or Russian academic institutions, those are the kind of institutions I've dealt with, they tend to be led by a person, right? Villanova is an institution, right? There are individual people who hold positions of authority, but what makes this work as an institution is that it's a whole organization. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are like that. The leaders can come and go. The organization has a life of its own. In Russia, organizations tend to depend on an individual who's the boss of this. And so if you are a person in that system, you know that the way to protect your interest is to find a powerful person and hope that that person can help you out if there's a problem. So I think the kind of regime, this kind of authoritarian regime, is not unwelcome to much of the population, because they assume that the only way for people's interests to be protected is if there's a boss who can crack down on corruption and help people out. But that means there's not a mechanism for communicating to the boss what the people want. And so I think that's what I mean by disconnect. There's not a disconnect in the sense that the Russian people want A, but the government does B. It's the Russian people never have a system for deciding what they want. And in the absence of that, the government makes decisions. Yes, sir?
How disruptive do you think social media is in Russia?
I get the sense it's quite disruptive. That's my impression. And I mean, I'm Facebook friends with a bunch of people in Russia. And what I've noticed there is there's a lot less activity since the war started. So my sense is that people have decided it's safer just to not, or you post pictures of kittens but I mean that there I think the government's been able to muzzle that. On the other hand, so I've been reading basically a handful of Russian nationalist bloggers on Telegram, which is this, I think it's based in Russia. It's a big social media platform. And they will post things that are intensely critical of the government. And they're critical from the right. So they're critical from the standpoint of why haven't we nuked the Ukrainians yet? Right? I mean, that's the attitude. But you can get voices being expressed there that I don't know that you could express them you'd express them in that form in the regular Russian media. So I do get the sense in that way that it's disruptive, in the sense of fragmenting the media space and making it harder to control. That's my impression. Yes, sir?
Would it be appropriate to say that the picking up and acquisition of Marxism in the 20th century was kind of facilitated by the anti-Western, anti-capitalistic sentiment that you get from the Napoleon Wars, more so than just the Russian economic system was, and also as kind of the second part to that, is it, or how did Marxism kind of interface with nationalism after 1917?
It's easier for me to answer the second part.
Okay.
I think so. I'll go there. I mean, inherently, Marxism is anti-nationalist, right? And Russian, if you look at the Bolsheviks, in their ideology, they were anti-nationalist, and the fundamental Bolshevik idea was that a revolution could never succeed in Russia alone, right? Because Russia is a backward country, and only an advanced country can have a socialist revolution. But if the Russians could have a revolution and hold power for even a brief period of time, then that could serve as an inspiration for the more advanced European countries to have a revolution. And then Europe and Russia would form one big socialist confederation that wouldn't be dominated by Russia, but that would be dominated by Europeans. So the original kind of Russian communist conception is, in that sense, very much anti-nationalist. It's very much about linking arms, not with the capitalist West, but with a future socialist West after the Great Revolution. Having said that, of course, what happened as an outcome of the Russian Civil War is a situation that the communists never expected, which is that they were held power in Russia, but the communists didn't gain power anywhere else. And any Marxist would have told you that that's impossible. That outcome can't happen, but it did. And at that point, what happened under Stalin in the 1930s is the Soviet communist doctrine was reinterpreted that the great socialist society of the future is going to be built specifically here in the Soviet Union. Right? We're not going to wait for the West to have their revolution, but we'll do it right here, right now. And why are we able to do this? Well, part of because we have great national traditions, and we're a great people, and we have great abilities. And so in that sense, it tied in with, or it increasingly became compatible with Russian nationalism. Once it became, and especially one of Stalin's arguments for why the Soviet Union had to modernize really fast is because eventually they'll get invaded by Nazi Germany. So some of this becomes about defending the country against foreign invaders. So under Stalin, there's very much a marriage of nationalism and communism that happens, that had not been there before 1917. And I think the sort of Putin version of nationalism is just a continuation of that. That by the time, once you got to Putin's time, the communist utopianism had really faded. And what was left over is that that Russian czars tried to build a great empire, and then the Soviets built a great empire. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
One thing that's fairly showing up quickly now is that a large number of Russians who are well educated and have money are heading to the gates.
Right.
And they're not going to serve in the military, they're going to be out of it. And those who are being dragged into the military have those lives for the military. So it would seem to be reversed, if the things that continue to go, unless they have to do it.
I'm sorry, I apologize, I didn't catch the very last thing that you said.
Yeah, no, I mean, they would have a hard time getting any large number of population.
That's the impression that you get. Or the impression that you get is that there is this brain drain of some of the best educated, most professionally promising people who are leaving. And then part of how the Russian government is getting people to stay or not to leave is to create new exemptions from the draft. So for example, there's university students I think are now exempted from the draft, which I think they weren't supposed to, maybe weren't supposed to before. And my guess is what all this is going to lead to is the same sense of unfairness that I think you had in the American draft and the Vietnam War, where there was also the sense that whether you serve or not is kind of a function of whether you're able to get out of the draft or not. So you really undercut the whole sense of patriotic unity by creating a system where only those who have no alternatives get sent.
Another question, it is my understanding that the February 24th date that began the war was connected to the beginning of the revolution in 1917 and the destruction of the royal family. Who sees himself as the heir of Russia?
I should know this. Is that the same day?
It was the revolution
February
that
24th.
Yeah, but the beginning of the February Revolution, is that February 24th?
I'm not quite sure.
I thought it was March 7th, but that could be the old.
Yeah, but it's the old and new calendar.
In the old calendar, it would have been February 24th, it was 2 weeks behind.
Huh.
Russia switched that.
Right, I mean, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, Russia had two revolutions in 1917, right? In the first one, the monarchy was overthrown, and then later the communists came to power. I did not know that.
As the heir apparent to the Tsar.
I mean, I thought wasn't this the same date when they invaded Crimea? And I mean, this date, the date was relevant to earlier events.
That was the date.
Yeah, I had not heard the 1917 connection. That would be interesting. I mean, Putin supposedly is very aware of historical anniversaries. So I mean, that much I've heard about it. But I think his self-portrayal, he's careful to balance between communist and anti-communist. I mean, in a sense, who Putin resembles ideologically is Napoleon, right? There's so Napoleon, as you came to power in the aftermath of the French Revolution, when French society was deeply polarized between supporters of the revolution and supporters of the old monarchy. And Napoleon tried to balance between the two. So he made himself a monarch, but he made himself emperor and not king, like they used to have. He allowed the Catholic Church to come back, but did not restore their old privileges. So he was careful to maintain a balance between these two elements. And Putin very much does the same. So he will, if you go to Moscow, right, you will see Lenin's mausoleum is still there. On the other hand, the red stars that used to be look over the square have been replaced with imperial eagles. And so whether you like Lenin or you like the imperial eagles, they're all there. And they all just get marketed kind of as a package to the Russian people as national greatness. Right? The czars were great and the communists were great, and it's all about greatness, and that's why we're in favor of it. So I think he will occasionally make reference to the monarchy. Like he made favorable reference to Peter the Great recently as sort of a model for himself. But like at the Victory Day parade, right, people are showing up in old Soviet uniforms. He's careful about that, I think, about mixing those two elements.
Yeah. With that date, I bring it up because at the time I was sitting with people somewhere around early February, and he said, "Is he going to go in or is he going?" And I said, "Mark your calendar, February 24th." I had read that somewhere.
It's totally possible.
Point, and that's exactly
Yeah.
what happened.
No, it is. I'm not questioning it. I hadn't heard that particular theory, so I have no thought-out opinion about it. But
He was telling us, so when it came down to 24th, I said, "You see,
no, so it's entirely possible. I just didn't know it.
I think
Yes.
we have maybe time for one more question before we move on to
Mhm.
So you mentioned that Putin's kind of main opposition, the Russians against Turkey, actually comes from the radical right. Those are even more nationalistic things. Is it fair to say that he's afraid that if this war becomes a patriotic war, if you have this full mobilization, and he loses, that he's not going to face a pro-democratic uprising? What he's afraid is that he'll get overthrown by those that are even more radical than it, and then this might evolve into something that he really doesn't want, like a third world war.
I'm really hesitant to stick my neck out about, current Russian politics, because who knows what's going on there. But definitely the analyses that I've read of this is that there's no mass organized democratic opposition. Right? There are lots of people with various democratic sympathies, but there's no movement that could organize something, and they don't have a foothold inside the government. But you have Putin's own regime, right? In his chain of command, the people he controls. And that's who's running the war in Ukraine, and that's who's doing really badly. And then you have all sorts of people who are connected with the military, with the secret police, these so-called military bloggers who apparently are very influential in military circles and write about military things. A lot of them are really intensely nationalistic. And so they're connected with the power structure of the regime, but they're somewhat independent and they're critical of what the government is doing. So presumably, and here I want to be really cautious because again, I'm a little bit out of my depth. Presumably the nightmare scenario for Putin would be that the ideas of a bunch of these right-wing bloggers wind up swaying some critical mass of generals or secret police leaders who say the boss is obviously mismanaging the war in Ukraine, and we need to get rid of him and replace him with someone who can do it right. So that would be my guess, that he's not worried about a democratic uprising from the street, but he's worried about some kind of internal being overthrown by people within the regime. And then these intellectuals and bloggers would be influential because they're setting out ideas and making arguments that other people might pick up on. And he can't easily crack down on them because they have the sympathy of a lot of the people inside the regime. So, for example, the leader of Chechnya, there's this guy Ramzan Kadyrov, who's the warlord in Chechnya. And it must be sort of something of a gangster character, is my impression of him. But he's really big in Russian security circles, right? He's sent troops from Chechnya to fight in Ukraine. He's publicly denounced the Russian military command in Ukraine as a bunch of wimps and incompetents who ought to be fired. And he's publicly said that Russia ought to be using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And Putin, so in other words, he's indirectly been very critical of Putin's regime. This is just in the last couple of days. And he's been promoted, I think, as a result of that to 3- or 4-star general. And he's not a professional military man. So I don't know if he has any kind of military rank, let alone a high-ranking general. But evidently, Putin has a sense that this is someone who has an independent power base and whom he needs to somehow bring on board. As opposed to, say, Alexei Navalny, the leader of the Democratic opposition, who's just sitting in a labor camp, right? The fact that Kadyrov got promoted and Navalny's in a labor camp tells you something about which of these people have clout in the regime and which ones don't.
Ironically, Kadyrov actually, he does have military experience, but it was from being a rebel warlord fighting Russia, and then he became a president.
Okay, yeah, exactly, thank you.